In the year 1260, the fate of civilizations hung by a thread. The Mongol Empire, the most terrifying force the world had ever seen, had swept westward like a storm of fire, crushing cities, toppling kingdoms, and reducing once proud dynasties into little more than ash and memory. Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, had fallen only 2 years before. Its libraries burned, its scholars slaughtered, and its caliph executed. Damascus had opened its gates, terrified by what resistance might bring. And as the Mongols surged forward, it seemed nothing, no fortress, no army, no empire, could stand in their way. Yet against all odds, on a dusty plain in Palestine, a single battle would change the trajectory of history forever. At Ḥain Jalut, the Mamluks of Egypt would meet the Mongol horde in combat, and what unfolded would decide not only the survival of the Islamic world, but the very balance of power in Eurasia. The clash was not merely military, it was existential. If the Mongols triumphed, nothing would stop them from sweeping into Egypt, North Africa, and perhaps beyond into Europe. But if the Mamluks could hold, they would prove that the empire of Genghis Khan was not invincible. The story begins not on the battlefield, but in the shattered cities that lay in the Mongols' wake. When Baghdad fell in 1258 under Hulagu Khan, brother of the great Khan Munka, the shockwaves reverberated across the known world. For centuries, the Abbasid Caliphate had been the spiritual heart of the Islamic world, even as its temporal power waned. To see it annihilated so utterly seemed to confirm that divine favor had shifted, that God had abandoned his people to punishment at the hands of these horsemen from the steppes. Chroniclers wrote of streets filled with corpses, rivers blackened with ink from destroyed manuscripts, and waters running red with blood. Survivors carried tales of horror into Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, and with them spread the fear that the Mongols were not merely conquerors, but the scourge of the last days. The Mongols themselves carried an aura of invincibility, forged through decades of unbroken victories. Since Genghis Khan first united the tribes of the steppe, their armies had carved a swath across China, Central Asia, and into Eastern Europe. Princes of Rus had been crushed, the Hungarians humbled, the Polish armies shattered. Cities like Nishapur, Merv, and Herat had been wiped from existence, their populations massacred in numbers so vast that even the chroniclers struggled to exaggerate them further. The Mongols fought with a precision and ferocity that bewildered their enemies. Their horse archers seemed to descend from the horizon like phantoms, encircling and cutting down opponents before they even understood what was happening. Discipline, mobility, and terror were their weapons, as much as bow and sword. To face them was, in the eyes of many, to face certain death. Yet in Egypt, a new power had arisen, hardened by its own struggles and animated by a fierce determination. The Mamluks, themselves once slaves of foreign origin, had seized the reins of the Sultanate through intrigue and blood. Purchased as boys from the steppes or the Caucasus, trained as warriors, and converted to Islam, they had risen through military ranks until at last they controlled the very throne. They were outsiders who had become rulers, guardians who had taken command, and they governed Egypt with a strange legitimacy rooted not in bloodlines, but in force of arms. Among them, one figure stood tall, Sultan Qutuz, a man whose own life mirrored the turmoil of the age. Captured as a youth, sold into bondage, and shaped by the brutal training of the Mamluk system, he had clawed his way to the top through skill, cunning, and sheer resilience. He was no mere monarch, but a survivor who understood the cost of weakness. For him, the Mongol threat was not an abstract terror, but a direct challenge to the very survival of his state. When the Mongol envoys arrived in Cairo bearing demands for submission, Qutuz faced a choice. To resist was to risk annihilation. To surrender was to consign his people to slavery. The envoy's words were chilling, promising mercy if Egypt submitted and ruin if it defied. But Qutuz was no trembling ruler. He knew what had happened to Baghdad. He had seen the fear in the faces of refugees who had fled Damascus, and he understood that appeasement would only delay the inevitable. In one of history's most dramatic moments of defiance, he ordered the envoys executed and their bodies hung from Cairo's gates. It was an act of open defiance against the greatest power on earth, a statement that Egypt would not bow. But defiance alone could not defeat the Mongols. Qutuz needed an army, and he found in his Mamluk warriors the perfect instrument. The Mamluks were more than soldiers. They were professionals forged in war, bound by loyalty not to family or tribe, but to their comrades and their order. They had inherited the traditions of steppe warfare themselves, for many were of Kipchak Turkic or Circassian origin. They understood the tactics of the Mongols, the feigned retreats, the encirclements, the deadly showers of arrows. They knew the horse, the bow, and the sword with an intimacy equal to their enemies. This symmetry, steppe-born fighting steppe-born, would prove decisive. Yet fate provided the Mamluks with a crucial opportunity. The Mongol army that had devastated the Middle East was not whole. Hulagu, the architect of the conquest, had withdrawn east with the bulk of his forces after the death of the great Khan Munka, leaving only a detachment in Syria under the command of Kitbuka, a skilled but isolated general. For the first time, the Mongols faced an enemy not with overwhelming force, but with a chance at parity. Still, Kitbuka's army was formidable, battle-hardened and feared. The balance of power hung on a knife's edge. The stage was set for confrontation, and the chosen ground was the plain of ʿAin Jalut, the spring of Goliath, a place already heavy with biblical echoes. Here, according to tradition, David had once slain the Philistine giant. Now, centuries later, another clash between a seeming giant and an underdog was about to unfold. For the Mamluks, the symbolism was clear. They would be David, striking down the Mongol Goliath. As dawn broke on September 3, 1260, the two armies faced each other across the dusty valley. The Mongols, with their disciplined ranks of cavalry, their standards fluttering and their reputation preceding them, exuded menace. The Mamluks, though fewer, stood firm, their banners of green and black catching the light, their hearts steeled by faith and necessity. Qutuz himself rode among them, rallying his men with words that blended defiance and hope. He reminded them of Baghdad's fate, of the innocents slaughtered, of the mosques desecrated. To falter here was to invite the same upon Cairo, upon their families, upon everything they loved. There could be no retreat. The battle began with the thunder of hooves and the hiss of arrows. The Mongols launched their customary barrage, darkening the sky with shafts. The Mamluks responded in kind, their own horse archers sending volleys back. The clash of arrows became a prelude to the clash of steel, and soon the plain erupted in chaos. Kitbuka, relying on the Mongols' tried and tested tactic, ordered a feigned retreat, luring the Mamluks into pursuit. For a moment, it seemed the Mamluks had fallen for the trap, surging forward into the jaws of encirclement. But this time, the tactic failed. The Mamluks, familiar with the Mongol ruse, had prepared. Hidden in the hills lay Mamluk reserves, waiting for the signal. As the Mongols wheeled around to envelop their pursuers, the trap was sprung. From the ridges, Mamluk cavalry charged down, slamming into the Mongol flanks. The hunters had become the hunted. In the midst of the melee, Qutuz himself threw off his helmet, his voice carrying above the din as he cried out, "O Islam! O Islam!" His men, emboldened by their sultan's courage, pressed harder. Steel clashed, horses screamed, and men fell. Dust choked the air, and the ground shook beneath the weight of combat. The struggle was desperate. Kitbuka fought fiercely, rallying his troops, refusing to yield, but gradually, inexorably, the tide turned. The Mongols, trapped and outmaneuvered, began to falter. One by one, their formations collapsed under the relentless Mamluk assault. Kitbuka himself was captured, defiant to the end, refusing to bow even in chains. His execution marked not just the death of a general, but the shattering of the Mongol aura of invincibility. When the dust settled, Ḥain Jalut was not just another battlefield, it was a turning point. For the first time, a Mongol army had been decisively defeated in open combat. The myth of their unstoppable conquest was broken. The Islamic world, though scarred and diminished, had survived. Egypt remained free, and from Cairo, the Mamluks would go on to dominate the Middle East for centuries. Europe, too, unknowingly owed a debt to the warriors of Ḥain Jalut. For had the Mongols triumphed, nothing would have stood between them and the Mediterranean world. The consequences rippled outward. The Mongol advance into the Middle East halted, never again to threaten Egypt. The Mamluks emerged as defenders of the Islamic heartlands, their prestige solidified, their legitimacy secured. In the memory of Muslim chroniclers, the victory became a sign of divine favor, proof that God had not abandoned his people. It was remembered as a moment when faith and courage triumphed over terror and despair. Yet the battle also revealed something deeper about history itself. That even the mightiest empires can be checked, that the course of events can hinge on a single day, a single plane, a single decision. Ḥain Jalut was more than a clash of armies. It was a clash of destinies, where the future of continents was shaped in dust and blood. From that moment, the Mongols were no longer invincible, and in that knowledge lay the seed of their eventual decline. The story of Ḥain Jalut endures because it captures the essence of history as drama, the rise of great powers, the terror of conquest, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unpredictable turning points that alter the fate of nations. It is a reminder that history is not inevitable, that even in the darkest hour, resistance can carve a new path. And so the spring of Goliath, once the stage for David's triumph, became again the site of a victory against overwhelming odds. A victory that changed history forever. The Mongol storm that swept across the 13th century was unlike anything the medieval world had ever encountered. The armies of Genghis Khan and his successors moved with a speed and ferocity that left kingdoms bewildered. Their strategy was as much psychological as it was military. Before their armies even arrived, rumors of entire cities being annihilated spread like wildfire, breaking the resolve of populations and rulers. When the Mongols approached, many cities chose surrender rather than defiance. Those who resisted were made into examples, their destruction so absolute that survivors, if any, could do nothing but carry the terror to the next city. This system of intimidation created a domino effect that collapsed resistance before battles were even fought. The brilliance of Mongol strategy lay not only in fear, but in coordination. The core of their army was the mounted archer, a soldier who grew up in the saddle, whose entire life was a preparation for war. Each warrior could ride for days, sleep in the saddle, and live off horse blood or milk if supplies failed. The composite bow they carried could pierce armor at long range, and the Mongols used it in deadly waves of fire, raining down volleys that disoriented and wore down opponents. Their tactics revolved around speed, deception, and encirclement. The feigned retreat was their signature move, luring enemy forces forward, stretching their lines, before wheeling around and surrounding them in a deadly trap. This combination of discipline and trickery devastated traditional armies used to set-piece battles. But the Mongols were not merely horse archers. They absorbed specialists from conquered lands, Chinese engineers who built siege weapons, Persian administrators who kept supply lines moving, craftsmen and scholars who enriched their empire. Their genius lay in adaptability. If one tactic failed, they borrowed another. If resistance was strong, they starved cities into submission. and always they struck with overwhelming force, giving their enemies little chance to recover. This machine, perfected over decades, now bore down upon the Middle East. Against this terrifying machine stood Egypt, ruled by the Mamluks. Their political order was unlike any other in the region. Where most dynasties traced legitimacy through bloodlines or divine descent, the Mamluks drew power from something else entirely: merit within a military brotherhood. Originally purchased as slaves, they were trained from childhood in martial arts, horsemanship, and Islamic learning. Their loyalty was first to their comrades, then to their patron, and finally to the state. When the Ayyubid dynasty that had once been founded by Saladin weakened, the Mamluks rose from kingmakers to kings themselves. Their rule was not without turbulence. Coups, assassinations, and rivalries were frequent. Yet this very instability forged leaders hardened by constant danger. The Sultan Qutuz was one such figure. Having himself been a Mamluk, he understood intimately the world of shifting alliances and ever-present threats. He had survived betrayal, imprisonment, and the precarious politics of Cairo. When he seized power, he knew he had little time to establish legitimacy. The Mongol threat gave him both a challenge and an opportunity. If he could defend Egypt and Islam against the greatest danger of the age, his rule would be cemented not by heritage, but by victory. The political context in Cairo was fragile. The population had heard the stories of Baghdad's fall, and many doubted whether resistance was possible. Some elites argued for submission, pointing out that cities which surrendered often avoided massacre. Others believed the Mongols were divine punishment, unstoppable by mortal arms. Qutuz's execution of the Mongol envoys was a calculated risk. It was not only a rejection of submission, but a rallying cry to unify his fractured realm. To kill envoys was to burn the bridge of negotiation. It left war as the only path forward, binding his people to him in a shared destiny of resistance. This defiance was paired with diplomacy. Qutuz reached out to neighboring powers, particularly the Crusaders still holding strongholds along the Levantine coast. Though they were traditional enemies of Egypt, the Crusaders too had reason to fear the Mongols, who had already devastated Christian kingdoms in Eastern Europe. At the very least, Qutuz secured neutrality from many Crusader garrisons, ensuring that his armies could march north without being harried from the flanks. In a world of shifting loyalties, it was a diplomatic triumph, allowing him to concentrate fully on the Mongol threat. The march northward was both a logistical and spiritual endeavor. The Mamluk army was composed not only of professional cavalry, but also levies and allies, their ranks swelled by those who understood that the fall of Egypt would mean the end of any hope for survival. Chroniclers speak of soldiers marching with grim determination, of sermons delivered before battle, reminding them that to fall against the Mongols was martyrdom, and to win was salvation for the Ummah. Their morale was buoyed by the sense that history itself was watching. Kitbuka, the Mongol general awaiting them, was no ordinary commander. Loyal to Hulagu and entrusted with the conquest of Syria, he had proven himself ruthless and effective. His army, though smaller than the host that had leveled Baghdad, was still formidable. Composed of Mongol cavalry and auxiliaries from subjugated peoples, it carried the same aura of terror. Kitbuka, moreover, was a man of iron will. Even when faced with unfavorable odds, he refused retreat, believing it dishonorable to abandon the Mongol cause. This stubbornness would contribute to both his glory and his downfall. The choice of battlefield was critical. The plains of ʿAin Jalut offered space for cavalry maneuvers, a terrain in which both sides excelled. Yet the presence of the spring and the surrounding hills gave opportunities for ambush. Qutuz and his general, the brilliant Baibars, exploited this. Baibars, himself a master tactician, understood the Mongol mind because he shared its origins. He proposed luring the Mongols into overconfidence, using their own feigned retreat against them. Qutuz agreed, and the plan was set. The Mamluks would engage, fall back in apparent weakness, then unleash hidden reserves at the decisive moment. On the morning of the battle, the air was thick with tension. Both armies arrayed themselves, banners snapping in the wind. The Mongols began with their familiar thunder, arrows launched in great arcs, horses charging, the earth shaking beneath their weight. The Mamluks met them with their own volleys, their horse archers weaving patterns of fire. To an observer, the clash might have seemed a mirror image. Two step-born styles colliding, both skilled in the dance of horse and bow. At first, the Mongols pressed their advantage. Kitbuka ordered a feigned retreat, pulling Mamluk forces forward, seeking to encircle them in the tried-and-true Mongol trap. Many times before, this maneuver had shattered armies. But this time, it met with disaster. Baibars and Qutuz anticipated the move. As the Mongols pursued, thinking their enemies in flight, the Mamluk reserves burst forth from the hills, charging into the Mongol flanks with ferocious cries. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. Dust rose so thick that men could scarcely see. Horses screamed, arrows whistled, swords rang against armor. Qutuz, throwing aside his helmet, rode into the thick of combat, his face uncovered as he cried, "O Islam, O Islam!" His visibility galvanized the troops, reminding them their sultan fought alongside them, sharing their danger. The Mongols, caught in a vice, fought savagely, but for the first time, their aura of invincibility cracked. Kitbuka himself, defiant to the last, refused to retreat. Surrounded, he was captured alive, cursing his enemies even in chains. His execution by the Mamluks symbolized more than the death of a general. It was the breaking of the spell that the Mongols cast over the world. For decades, they had seemed unstoppable, as if heaven itself willed their conquest. But at Ḥain Jalut, mere men had stood against them and prevailed. The victory's impact cannot be overstated. Militarily, it halted the westward Mongol advance. Politically, it secured the Mamluk regime in Egypt, elevating Qutuz and Baibars as heroes. Spiritually, it reinvigorated the Islamic world, offering proof that God's favor still rested upon them. The Mongols would remain a formidable power, but never again would they break into the heart of the Middle East. The balance of power had shifted, and the world was forever altered. The legacy of Ḥain Jalut lived on not only in chronicles, but in the shaping of empires. The Mamluks, buoyed by victory, would dominate the region for centuries, guardians of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, protectors of Islam against external threats. The Mongols, though still mighty, would find their energies divided, their empire eventually fragmenting into separate khanates. The dream of global conquest had met its first immovable wall, and that wall stood in Palestine. Imagine the sky above the Jezreel Valley darkening not with storm clouds, but with arrows, 10,000 of them arcing like a black rain, the air filled with the metallic scent of bowstrings and the thundering hooves of 100 squadrons. It is the morning of September 3rd, 1260, and on a spring called Ḥain Jalut, two worlds meet. The disciplined, merciless machine of the Mongol conquests and the newly forged, hard-edged power of the Mamluk Sultanate. What happens here will not be merely another chapter in a chronicle of wars. It will be the hinge on which centuries swing. By the end of the day, the Mongol tide that had appeared unstoppable for decades will break, and a new order in the Middle East will begin to right itself. The date, the place, and the outcome, Mamluk victory at Ḥain Jalut, are fixed in the bones of history. To understand the violence of that day, you must first understand the instrument on the other side of the field. The Mongol army that rolled across Eurasia was not a mob of barbarians, but a state-made engine of war. Units organized in tens and hundreds and thousands, men trained to live on horseback, to sleep in the saddle, to fire accurately while galloping, and to move faster than any opponent could hope to keep pace with. Their bows were composite, their arrows deadly at range, and their logistics and intelligence, scouting, relay posts, and the appropriation of conquered people's specialists made them adaptable. Beyond their weapons lay a psychological doctrine, terror as strategy. The scorched earth example of a resisting city would echo ahead of the host to the next city's gates, making siege unnecessary because surrender became the rational choice. This combination of mobility, combined arms, engineers from China, cavalry from the steppe, auxiliaries from subjugated regions, and a bureaucratic war machine is what made them such a lethal force across continents. When Hulagu's armies swept through Persia and Iraq in the 1250s, their speed and savagery seemed to confirm that nothing human could contain them. And yet, the Mongols were not omnipotent. Their power had limits, logistical, political, and temporal. When Mungka Khan died in 1259 on a campaign in China, the resulting political convulsion forced Hulagu to withdraw the greater part of his army eastward to attend the Kurultai that would decide succession, leaving only a detachment under Kitbuka in Syria. That withdrawal created the slender window the Mamluks would exploit. It is vital to read the campaign not as a single unstoppable arc, but as a set of opportunities and fractures. The same momentum that built the Mongol juggernaut also required constant political attention and personnel. With the main force gone, the Mongols in Syria were powerful but vulnerable, skilled but isolated. From Cairo rose the Mamluk response, a polity born in the crucible of military slavery and internecine politics, now hardened into an instrument of state. The Mamluks were slaves, bought as boys, trained in the arts of war, converted and elevated. Yet their soldiers' meritocratic ascent produced a uniquely professional force. They respected discipline, craved honor, and trusted the lance and bow like life itself. Into this world came Qutuz, a sultan whose own biography read like a manual of survival, captured, sold, trained, then rising in the bloody courtrooms of Cairo to seize power. Alongside him was Baibars, a tactician of rare instinct, a man whose life straddled the cultures of steppe and Levant, and whose intimate knowledge of steppe warfare would prove decisive. In the months leading to ʿAin Jalut, both men had to solve a political riddle. How to unify a fractious Egypt, neutralize, or at least blunt, enemy forts and crusader interference, and assemble an army whose heart beat as one in the face of terror. Qutuz's act of killing and displaying Mongol envoys in Cairo was more than outrage. It was the irreversible commitment to war, and an act that galvanized supporters by removing the alternative of submission. When we try to pin down numbers, we must be honest about the historian's task. Sources vary, exaggerate, and sometimes contradict. Contemporary chroniclers inflate or minimize for purpose. Modern historians triangulate from logistics, garrison records, and reasoned reconstruction. Most modern estimates place both forces in the low tens of thousands. Broadly speaking, many scholars suggest figures in the 10,000, 20,000 range for each side. The terrain shaped the battle like a sculptor shaping clay. ʿAin Jalut sits at the foot of Mount Gilboa. The spring, the valley, and the surrounding hills are not merely scenic details but strategic architecture. For cavalry, the plain offered speed and space. For an ambusher, the flanks and ridges offered concealment and height. Kitbuka, knowing the ground's value, occupied strong positions with water and pasture underfoot, practical for a cavalry army, and commanded a field that permitted his usual tactics: rapid, coordinated maneuvers, and the feigned retreat. The Mamluks, for their part, used the hills and scrub not as mere observation points, but as holding areas for reserves and staging grounds for a counterstroke. To understand ʿAin Jalut is to see the meeting of steppe mobility and Levantine geography, each side trying to bend the land to their doctrine. The opening phase of the fighting followed the expectations of both commanders. Light cavalry skirmishes, missile exchanges, probing attacks, all the motions of a cavalry war. Mongol scouts stretched forward, Mamluk horse archers returned fire. The combat was a choreography of speed. Archers discharging in rolling waves, mounted squadrons brushing past each other like fast-moving fish. The Mongols, confident in their proven formula, initiated the feigned retreat, the psychological trick that had unmade so many opponents. They would appear to pull back in disorder, drawing pursuers into open ground where an enveloping maneuver would close the trap. That morning, as the Mamluks surged forward, they thought they saw the familiar pattern repeat. Mongol units breaking and running, and the natural response, pursue and rout, took hold among charged warriors hungry to turn the enemy. But Baibars had read the Mongol playbook and turned it into his own. He had staged his forces intentionally. A visible vanguard, a controlled retreat, and a tightly held reserve lodged unseen in the folds of the hills. He allowed elements of his force to appear to overcommit to the chase, to feed the Mongol sense of victory. When the Mongol units wheeled to envelop the apparently fleeing Mamluks, the Mamluk reserves thundered down the slopes into the gap. For the first time on a Mongol battlefield, the hunter became the hunted. The reserves struck the Mongol flanks with shock tactics, heavier lances and close combat cavalry breaking into the bowlines, and disrupted the cohesion essential to Mongol maneuvers. The Mongol advantage in range dominance was compromised when distances closed under sudden, violent shock. Tactical professions and roles on the field were clear and built on centuries of horse war culture. Mongol tumens, nominally units of 10,000 but often smaller in practice, moved with internal discipline, scouts, flanking detachments, mounted archers, and wedge-shaped shock elements. The Mamluks mirrored this with a division between mobile skirmishers and shock cavalry. Many Mamluk commanders deliberately massed heavy cavalry for the decisive counterpunch. During the crucial midday phase, the tempo of the battle changed. Long-range shooting gave way to close quarters. Horses slammed, lances splintered, and the battle-esque acoustic turned from the whistle of arrows to the scream of steel on steel. Kutuz, leading from the center or near the reserve, rode with such visibility that chroniclers later recorded his unhelmeted shout, "O Islam!" A cry meant as much to rally souls as to command bodies. That moment sealed the Mamluks' psychological advantage. They had not only matched Mongol technique, they had outmaneuvered it. The execution of the ambush must be seen as a coordination masterpiece. Imagine the battlefield as a clock face. Baibars baited from the 12:00 position with a disciplined withdrawal. Mongol pursuit streamed straight toward noon. At 3:00 and 9:00, hidden forces slid down the hills. The flanking strikes did not arrive as isolated charges, but as a converging storm that cut supply and command lines within the Mongol order. Encirclement in reverse, where the pursuers, rather than the retreaters, found themselves surrounded, broke cohesion. Mongol units that depended on mutual support found themselves cut off, and the constant rain of Mamluk strikes turned tactical menace into rout. In the chaos, Kitbuka's position became untenable. He fought with characteristic fury. Mongol leaders seldom surrendered. But the day had turned against him. Sources report his capture and subsequent execution. Symbolically, his death reverberated far beyond the field, puncturing the Mongol aura of destiny. The phases of the fight can be parsed to highlight how small margins mattered. Phase 1. Reconnaissance and skirmish. Each side tests the other, measures strengths. Phase 2. Main engagement. Archery and probes escalate, feigned retreats are attempted. Phase 3. The trap. Pursuit leads to overextension, reserves commit. Phase 4. Collapse. Encircled units break, command phrase, and rout sets in. Phase 5. Mopping up an outcome, pursuers become prey as discipline dissolves into slaughter or capture. At every stage, the Mamluks had prepared contingency plans. Their reserves were not an afterthought, but the axis on which the entire operation turned. Where Mongol success usually relied on creating and exploiting gaps, at Āin Jalut they found the gap exploited to the opposite effect. This inversion of tactics, using the Master S weapon against him, was the genius of Baibars and the courage of Kutuz's leadership. We must also consider the role of allied contingents and the human texture beneath the numbers. The Mongol host in Syria included not only Mongol horsemen, but also vassal contingents, Georgian and Armenian troops and local levies pressed into service. Their loyalty could vary with circumstance. Far from home and facing an opponent who struck with unity and certainty, those contingents sometimes wavered. On the Mamluk side, the troops were a coalition too, professional Mamluk corps, Ayyubid remnants loyal to local emirs, and volunteers galvanized by religious and existential conviction. The social psychology of the battlefield mattered. Troops who believed themselves defending hearth and faith often fought with a ferocity that complemented tactical planning. In short, success at Āin Jalut was not only a matter of numbers or equipment, but of cohesion and purpose. The immediate aftermath on the field was brutal and unequivocal. Once the Mongol formations broke, there was little mercy. Cavalry routes in medieval battle often turned into exterminations because fleeing units could not reform and were subjected to pursuit. The Mamluks, aware of what Mongol victory would mean for their world, showed little quarter to a force that had razed Baghdad and Damascus. Kitbuka's death, whether in the melee or in execution shortly afterwards, was a psychological collapse as much as a tactical one. The Ilkhanate's forward presence in the Levant blinked out, not because the Mongol state had been defeated globally, but because this defeat removed the forward garrison and undercut immediate Mongol momentum. The larger Mongol polity would persist and splinter into Khanates, but the dream of a continuous Mongol march to the Mediterranean was checked here. Strategically, the consequences ripple outward like concentric waves. For the Mamluks, victory meant something more than survival. It brought prestige and legitimacy. In the years after Āin Jalut, the Mamluk regime consolidated control of the Levant and eventually the holy cities themselves, casting itself as the defender of Islam against invasion. Baibars rose from a brilliant general to one of the Sultanate's defining rulers. Kutuz's fate, he would soon be assassinated in a palace coup, reminded the listener that military triumph and palace intrigue often travel hand in hand in medieval polities. For the Mongols, the rout marked the point where expansion met immutable limits. Supply, political fragmentation, and the challenges of ruling diverse sedentary empires would prevent a simple continuation of the conquest pattern that had worked so spectacularly in open steppe and the broken polities of Central Asia. In geopolitical terms, Europe's long-term exposure to a Mongol gateway from the Levant was reduced. The Mediterranean world breathed, however briefly, without the immediate shadow of conquest. If we return to the field one last time, we see the small human gestures that make legend. A general throwing aside helmet and armor to show his face to his men. A reserve commander, hidden in scrub, setting a signal and waiting with a mixture of dread and hope. A platoon of horse archers converting their practiced retreat into panic when surrounded. A standard-bearer refusing to yield until the spear breaks from his hand. The drama of Āin Jalut is not only about the collapse of a strategy, but about decisions at critical thresholds. When to commit, when to hold, how to read the enemy's intent. Baibars' tactical patience, Kutuz's political will, and the discipline of the Mamluk men, willing to pursue and yet stop at the appointed moment, made the impossible possible. History loves to enshrine moments of rupture, and Āin Jalut is one such hinge. But hinges are only thresholds. The centuries that followed required statesmen to consolidate, reform, and govern, not merely to win a single day. The Mamluk victory granted them the breathing room to do so. The Mongol aura of inevitability was gone, replaced by an image of a potent but finite empire. Still dangerous, still transformative, but no longer unassailable. The world that emerged would be shaped by commerce rerouted, cities that survived becoming hubs of new administration, and an intellectual world where the loss of Baghdad's libraries would be mourned for generations, even as new centers of learning persisted elsewhere. Walking away from those fields, we carry a lesson. Military genius is a conversation between mind and place. The Mongols brought a script. The Mamluks rewrote it by bending terrain, timing, and morale to their will. If one searches for the precise moment when a sweeping historical current was altered, ʿAin Jalut is where the Mongol wave met a reef. Not every single human life that was changed that September can be chronicled, but the broad turn is unmistakable. An empire that seemed destined to sweep all before it found a limit, and a polity born of servitude and steel won its place in history by doing what leaders must do: turn courage into coordination. The day ends as days like this often do, with the smell of smoke and blood and the long work of burying and counting. But the scene that follows is different. Envoys arrive in Cairo with news of victory. Prayers of thanksgiving rise in mosques. Leaders who had once feared the horizon now sit to plan a new order. And yet history never rests long. The triumph at ʿAin Jalut answers one question only to open many others, about governance, the nature of warfare, and the long-term fate of an interconnected Eurasia. That is the point at which our story pauses, not finished, but transformed. There are other fields to cross: the political rearrangements in Syria and Anatolia, the Mongol responses in Persia, the Mamluks' consolidation, and their eventual centuries-long rule. And each of these paths begins here, at a spring where arrows once rained and men decided the fate of worlds. If you would like, we can follow one of those paths next, into the palace intrigues that followed the victory, into the logistics, how an army of horses and men lived off the land, or into a soldier's life on both sides of the line, seeing how training, diet, and culture translate into battlefield performance. Which thread shall we pull first?